If editors think that they can avoid that, I take my hat off to them. There's absolutely no way you can avoid disaster if somebody wants to lie to you. You just, there's no foolproof system. You can catch them in most of the lies, but and that was such a lie that nobody could conceive of it.
In September of 1980, a story appeared in the Washington Post. Titled Jimmy's World, it detailed the hard life and times of the eponymous 8-year-old. From the very first sentence, the article makes its intentions very clear. Quote, Jimmy is 8 years old and a third-generation heroin addict. A precocious little boy with sandy hair, velvety brown eyes, and needle marks freckling the baby-smooth skin of his thin brown arms. Coming in at just a hair above 2,000 words, the article created a firestorm in not only the world of journalism, eventually going on to win some of the most highly sought-after awards in printed media, but the world of politics as well. Many have since stated that this story heavily contributed to the public support of America's war on drugs, something we may never learn the true ramifications of. The public outcry from the surrounding area of the story, Washington, D.C., was deafening. The author of the article, an aspiring and talented young writer who was at the beginning of what appeared to be a long and promising career, would end up at the very top of the journalistic world. Within months, they found themselves receiving accolades reserved for the best in the business, unwittingly putting a target on their back in the process. After all, when you work your way to the peak of a field in a very short amount of time, there's really only one place left for your career to go. More than a year before the publication of Jimmy's World, on July 12, 1979, the executive editor of the Washington Post received a letter. It was personally addressed to him, Benjamin Bradlee. Quote, Dear Mr. Bradlee, I have been a full-time reporter for The Blade for slightly more than 2 years, and I believe I am now ready to tackle the challenge of working for a larger newspaper in a major city. The letter had been sent by Janet Cooke, a young reporter who had been born and raised in Toledo, Ohio. She still lived in Toledo, with The Blade being the town's local newspaper. In addition to the letter, Ms. Cooke had also mailed in 6 of the articles she had written for The Blade, pieces which showcased her writing talent. Ben Bradlee, the executive editor of the Washington Post, had become a bit of a cult figure in the world of journalism. Bradlee had served in his position since 1968 and had overseen the release of the Pentagon Papers, the very same scandal that was just recently made into an Academy Award-nominated film. In fact, in that movie, The Post, directed by Steven Spielberg, Bradlee was portrayed by none other than Tom Hanks. He had also been overseeing the work of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein throughout the Watergate scandal, cementing his own place in American history. Bradlee was impressed by the writing of this relatively unknown Janet Cooke, as well as her academic qualifications. In her letter and resume, she claimed to be a 1976 Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Vassar College. The hiring process at the Washington Post was a democratic selection. Despite Ben Bradlee seeming to carry the weight of the journalistic world upon his shoulders, he would constantly defer on hirings and firings to the rest of the staff. He floated her resume and her pieces to the rest of the editors and executives working for the paper, and it was a unanimous decision to bring her in for an interview. 2 weeks later, Janet Cooke flew in from Toledo, Ohio. Tom Wilkinson, the assistant managing editor for personnel, stated about her, quote, Janet Cooke came in and saw everyone and was pretty high on everyone's list. What impressed me is that she had pretty well created her own beat. She seems to be a pretty good self-starter. I found her to be very smart. Over the next few months, as the staff of the Post waited for the timing and the fit to be just right, they continued to float the idea of bringing on Janet Cooke to their writing staff. Towards the end of the year, they finally decided to extend an offer to Ms. Cooke, and she accepted quicker than any of them anticipated. Janet Cooke began working at the Washington Post on January 3rd, 1980, a Thursday. Despite showing up for her first day nearly 2 hours late, having gotten lost in between the post office building and her hotel 3 blocks away, she quickly made a good impression on those she worked with. She showed up wearing a red wool suit with a white silk shirt, just the first of many dazzling outfits she would wear while employed by the Washington Post. She was assigned to the staff of the weeklies, a nickname given to the district weekly section of the paper. This dealt with stories local to the area, meaning the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. To many of the minority staff members and reporters of the Washington Post, the weeklies had another nickname, the Ghetto. Her supervisor on the weeklies, another young reporter named Vivian Applin Brownlee, recalled her own memories of working with Janet. Quote, "She was consumed by blind and raw ambition. It was obvious, but it doesn't deny the talent." You see, Janet did not see herself working for the weekly staff for that long. For her, the weeklies were a way to set herself up for bigger and better things. She wanted to establish a journalistic reputation before moving on to the Metro staff, the part of the paper where she would get to work on larger stories, alongside the same reporters that broke the Pentagon Papers and Watergate stories a decade beforehand. Her goal was to work alongside Bob Woodward, a legendary name in journalism and the editor of the Metro staff. Carlin Barker, a reporter at Metro, described the high benchmark that Janet Cooke was establishing for herself. Quote, "She set enormous goals for herself. She wanted Pulitzer Prize in 3 years, and she wanted to be on the national staff in 3 to 5 years. She had winner written all over her, although it was strange. Every day she acted as though she was protecting her job. She was the last person who needed to do that." Despite the ambition written all over her, those that she worked with described Janet as a very talented writer. Whatever she lacked in social graces, such as the ability to dress down for interviews with her story subjects, she made up for in writing prowess. Over the next 9 months, Janet would write 52 stories for the Washington Post District Weekly, many of which described local police beats and the area's rampant drug use. She made a good number of contacts during this time, and her reporter's instincts seemed to be honing in on how to best approach touchy subjects. During this time, though, she was also going through some personal drama. In February, after working at the paper for about a month, she had started a tumultuous relationship with another Washington Post reporter named Mike Sager. Sager, who would later go on to have an outstanding career in writing, was just a lowly reporter who would be at the post office late at night, listening to the police scanner for any breaking stories he could respond to. In his words, quote, "While we lasted officially only until June, our relationship continued in fits and starts for another year, a painful, exhilarating 20-something psychodrama, during which time the Jimmy story was produced." Other than this volatile relationship, Janet made another close acquaintance from the paper, Elsa Walsh. Walsh was a reporter who also worked for the District Weekly, who would become Janet's roommate. Quote, "Janet was hard to live with, very high-strung. She bought clothes lavishly. Every day she talked about her ambitions. She had no sense of the past or even the present, except its consequences for the future. She always looked to the future, and she did not care about the people she left behind." Halfway through 1980, after working for the Washington Post for about half a year, Janet began work on the story that would later define her career. As she recounted to a friend at a later date, quote, "This story is my ticket off the weekly." She had originally been tasked by her supervisor, Vivian Applin Brownlee, to investigate a new strand of heroin which was rumored to have hit the streets of Washington, D.C. As she began her investigating, eventually culminating in over 2 hours of recorded interviews with social workers, and over 145 pages of handwritten notes, her story began to take shape. When the story that would become Jimmy's World was prepared for publication, it was recommended for the daily Metro portion of the Washington Post. Janet Cooke was getting closer to realizing her career ambitions. Lawyers and editors were brought in to consult on the story. After going through the piece with a fine-tooth comb, they decided to omit certain details, such as names or dates or even trivial pieces of information, all in order to prevent a libel lawsuit. The staff brought in their art director, Bob Barkin, to create a terrifying image that would captivate readers from the get-go. Janet Cooke was told to present the story personally to Bob Woodward, legendary reporter and then editor of the Washington Post. She was successful at pitching the story, which was evident by Woodward's later statements about Janet herself. Quote, "She was a terrific actress. Terrific." Milton Coleman, another of the Washington Post editors, was less than enthused about the story. He had been the primary point person for the article, having originally given Janet the idea to give up the lead on the new strand of heroin, and follow up on the rumors of an 8-year-old drug addict. Coleman was legitimately worried on behalf of Cooke, who had been working for the Post for less than 1 calendar year. On a Friday sometime in September, he spoke to Janet about the article she had written. Quote, "I said she had written a story that is certain to be controversial. You have seen a crime, and you may be subpoenaed. We don't think so, but you can. You should know that the Post will stand behind you 100%. If you are subpoenaed, and you refuse to reveal your sources, you may be found in contempt of court and have to spend time in jail. Before the story goes, if you don't want to face that, we won't run it. Think it over, tell me in the morning." Sure enough, early that Saturday morning, Janet called into Coleman and told him that she was ready for the piece to be published. They made the final arrangements for the story, and the following day saw its publication. Readers of the Washington Post were greeted by a horrifying image at the front of their Sunday morning newspaper. The graphic image showed a beanpole skinny black boy, the titular Jimmy, wearing a collared polo shirt. His skinny arm was being gripped by a large fist, while another hand was inserting a syringe into his bleeding lower arm. In the background, 2 shadowy and ominous figures loomed over Jimmy. The title of the story was Jimmy's World, with a subtitle that read, "8-year-old heroin addict lives for a fix." Approximately 892,220 copies of the paper were printed off for the press that morning, and they were then distributed to doctors' offices, break rooms, and even front doorsteps. The story itself went on to detail the life of Jimmy, an 8-year-old boy with sandy hair, brown eyes, and needle marks running down the length of his long, skinny arms. He was a fan of the Baltimore Orioles, who had been addicted to heroin since the age of 5. Jimmy talked about how he did not enjoy going to school, but he gave his undivided attention to his math classes. Jimmy seemed to have a solid understanding of economics, knowing that any future path to success lay in being able to properly do math. Quote, "I want to have me a bad car and dress good and also have me a good place to live. So, I pretty much pay attention to math because I know I gotta keep up when I finally get me something to sell. You got to know how to do some figuring if you want to go into business." Jimmy was a 3rd-generation heroin addict, following his mother, Andrea, and her own parents. He lived with his mother Andrea and her live-in boyfriend, Ron, who also happened to be Jimmy's biggest enabler. Ron sold heroin in the dining room of their house. He would cook the drug in the kitchen and allow his customers to fire up, quote-unquote, in the bedrooms. He also happened to share his drugs with 8-year-old Jimmy. Quote, "He'd be bugging me all the time about what the shots were and what people was doing, and one day he said, 'When can I get off?' I said, 'Well shit, you could have some now.' I let him snort a little and, damn, the little dude really did get off." Andrea, Jimmy's mother, was as much of a victim as anyone. She had grown up in a similar situation as Jimmy, with her mother, her mother's boyfriend, and a sister. As the story progressed, you learned that teenage Andrea had been repeatedly raped by her mother's boyfriend, eventually resulting in Jimmy himself. Quote, "I didn't even name him, you know? My sister liked the name Jimmy and I said, okay, call him that, who gives a fuck? I guess we gotta call him something, don't we?" After giving birth to Jimmy, she had fallen into a cycle of shoplifting and prostitution that eventually landed her in the world of drugs. Despite this, she seemed to show very little regard for her own son. Quote, "I don't really like to see him fire up, but you know, I think he would have gotten into it one day. Anyway, everybody does. When you live in the ghetto, it's all a matter of survival. If he wants to get away from it when he's older, then that's his thing. But right now, things are better for us than they've ever been. Drugs and black folk been together a long time. The article goes on to serve as an urgent cry for help. It describes a new strand of heroin called Golden Crescent, which was being shipped in from Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. It was allegedly much more potent and lethal than what had already been seen on the streets of Washington, D.C. The article also describes Jimmy being a sole example of an epidemic plaguing the nation, of children his age and younger becoming familiar with drugs. Jimmy himself had aspirations of becoming a drug dealer someday. Quote, just like my man Ron. He had been spending his days with older boys, teenagers who were also involved in the world of drugs. The article alleges that most of them spent their days getting high on either marijuana or PCP, and they dealt drugs themselves. The story ends on a heartbreaking note, where Jimmy is given a dose of heroin by Ron, his mother's boyfriend. Quote, at the end of the evening of strange questions about his life, Jimmy slowly changes into a different child. The calm and self-assured little man recedes. The jittery and ill-behaved boy takes over as he begins going into withdrawal. He is twisted uncomfortably in his chair 1 minute, irritatingly raising and lowering a vinyl window blind the next. Be cool, Ron admonishes him, walking out of the room. Jimmy picks up a green Star Wars Force Beam toy and begins flickering the lights on and off. Ron comes back into the living room, syringe in hand, and calls the little boy over to his chair. Let me see your arm. He grabs Jimmy's left arm just above the elbow, his massive hand tightly encircling the child's small limb. The needle slides into the boy's soft skin like a straw pushed into the center of a freshly baked cake. Liquid ebbs out of the syringe, replaced by bright red blood. The blood is then re-injected into the child. Jimmy has closed his eyes during the whole procedure, but now he opens them, looking quickly around the room. He climbs into a rocking chair and sits, his head dipping and snapping upright again, in what addicts call the nod. Pretty soon, man, Ron says. You got to learn how to do this for yourself. The immediate response to the article was pure, unadulterated shock. Most of the readers were horrified that the story could be real, that something this tragic could be going on right under the nose of those in power, right in the heart of America. The readers were also horrified that the reporter, Janet Cooke, had done nothing to help 8-year-old Jimmy. Some more astute readers, who doubted the veracity of Cooke's claims throughout the article, were more offended that something which appeared so racist and criminal could make the front page of the Washington Post. By the next day, Monday, September 30th, the police chief of Washington, D.C., Bertell M. Jefferson, had ordered a wide-ranging search for the boy described in the article. They had called their youth division into work the day before, when the article was published, to begin searching their records and neighborhoods for the boy. Maurice Turner, who worked in the police administration and would become police chief the next year, in 1981, would later state that the police had been prepared to offer a reward upwards of $10,000. Carolyn Bowden, the supervisor of the Department of Human Services, stated that beginning on Monday morning, her office would receive hundreds of phone calls pertaining to Jimmy. All of the callers, she stated, were expressing, quote, shock and terror. To her credit, the DHS began cooperating fully with law enforcement in the search for 8-year-old Jimmy, a search that was ultimately unsuccessful in finding him. Quote, so far we've had no success. If we don't hear anything by this evening, we're going to appeal to radio stations to broadcast an appeal for anyone with information to call us 24 hours a day, or call the police. Bowden also stated, quote, I believe the child's life is in danger. I really do. Bear in mind, he's only 8 years old. He's said to be small. If the drugs aren't given in the correct dosage, I'd say he's in real danger. This newspaper article could be the child's epitaph. The public outcry from the article was so loud and far-reaching that wife of presidential candidate Ronald Reagan, Nancy, was even quoted in a follow-up article. Quote, how terribly sad to read it and to know there are so many others like him out there. I hope with all my heart I could do something to help them. Surely there must be a way. Nancy Reagan, as I'm sure you're all well aware, would become the First Lady of the United States just a few months later. Her pet project, which she helped implement legislation and executive action upon, was the war on drugs, which has led to many long-lasting sociological and criminal justice ramifications. It's impossible to tell whether her mission statement was inspired at all by Jimmy's World, but it's impossible to deny that the article helped inspire many thousands of readers to support it. Richard Cohen, another columnist for the Washington Post, wrote in a heartfelt piece of his own, quote, "I do not know either how a reporter can find her way to an 8-year-old who is an addict, but the police do not know. How is this possible? How is it possible that the drug enforcement people, with their trillions of dollars in federal aid, and their computers, and their police officers, did not know of this kid, could not do what a reporter could do? Somewhere in all this is a story of failure, of massive failure. Somewhere in all this is a story of agencies not caring or not doing their jobs, of money being spent on the wrong things, of schools not paying attention, of well-meaning but defeated teachers who cannot cope, and also, maybe just as important, neighbors who knew or suspected but didn't do a thing. Somewhere in all this are a lot of questions that the city, the school system, and mayor ought to answer. An 8-year-old boy is about to die. Somebody, for crying out loud, ought to care." Despite this public outcry, with thousands, if not millions of people desperate to help this drug-addicted child, one person seemed poised to benefit from the story's publication. Janet Cooke reached her next career goal, being moved from the weekly staff to the Metro daily staff upon the publication of Jimmy's World. The Washington Post stood steadfast in its support of Janet Cooke. When law enforcement began reaching out to the paper to obtain their sources, the paper went into what it called Watergate mode, a term coined by Bob Woodward. This is when their goal is to, quote, "protect the source and back the reporter." As they later told the police, quote, "Lawyers for the Post, citing First Amendment provisions of the U.S. Constitution, have refused to disclose the information." One week after the publication of the first article, a follow-up was published in the Washington Post. This time, Janet Cooke was credited alongside other Post writers, including Louis Simons. A quote from the article seems to double down on the claims made in Jimmy's World. Quote, "Children in the area close to Jimmy's age know him and of his involvement in drugs. He's bad," says one 11-year-old, who adds he doesn't have the same shit Jimmy used, but I can get some. Another boy, 10, says of drugs, "I don't see nothing wrong if you be feeling good and make some cash too. Me and my friend can get you some herb if you need it." Despite this supposed doubling down of the original story by the Post, things were beginning to crack underneath the surface. Many in the Post began to privately doubt the narrative created by Janet Cooke. Whether this was inspired by their personal relationships with her, or by her unwillingness to provide any particular details, is impossible to tell. However, there were also those in the public sphere that began to voice their concerns of the story's legitimacy. Washington, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry called off the search for Jimmy on October 15, 1980, just a little over 2 weeks after the story was originally published. Quote, "We are kind of giving up on that." Barry had originally helped out with the efforts to find Jimmy, but was beginning to grow publicly displeased at the Post's inability to supply any information in their effort to save the boy's life. Quote, "I've been told the story was part myth and part reality." He continued, quote, "We have all agreed that we don't believe that the mother or the pusher would allow a reporter to see them shoot up." This was a point that was beginning to get made over and over again, which made some sense for the doubters of the story. Why would a drug dealer share their stash with an 8-year-old boy, something that provided them nothing, financially or personally? Behind closed doors, the lawyers for the Washington Post were growing concerned that the police were preparing to launch a lawsuit against the organization, either for wasting police resources or supplying the public with faulty information. However, some real-world ramifications would present themselves over the next few months. On November 28, 1980, a woman named Mary Thompson claimed that the story Jimmy's World had resulted in her child being taken away from her. Earlier that month, Thompson had taken her 5-year-old son into a doctor's office. During their visit, blood and tuberculin skin tests were performed, which left physical marks on the child's skin. Weeks later, the kid's teacher noticed the marks on his arm. He allegedly made the remark of, quote, "Needles make me feel better," at which point the teacher escorted him to the principal's office. Social workers were called, who then included the police. The police took the 5-year-old to the hospital, where his blood was tested for any drugs. They claimed that trace amounts of 2 barbiturates were found in his system, which just so happened to be chemicals found in common children's medicines. Mary Thompson, the boy's mother, was at work and could not respond until that evening, at which point she found out that a court order had been issued. Her 5-year-old son was being taken away from her because of the results from the blood test, and the kid's out-of-context quote. She claimed that when she went to the youth division headquarters to see her son, detectives interrogated her, claiming to know that she had injected her own kid with drugs and accused her of, quote, "shooting up with him." About this unfolding story, Mary Thompson shared her thoughts with reporters. Quote, "I haven't given my kid any drugs. This is ridiculous. Is this what justice is all about? I can't believe this is happening." She would later go on to call the entire ordeal stupid and ridiculous. She claimed that the only reason this was happening was because police saw the marks on her son's arms, and because of the article published in the newspaper a little over a month beforehand, they leaped to their conclusion. Quote, "That's why they're on me, because of Jimmy." It wasn't until mid-January, nearly 6 weeks later, that Mary Thompson's son was finally returned home to her. The judge ruled that the evidence used to take her son out of her custody was insufficient, stating that if he had been given barbiturates to the level in which police described, the 5-year-old would have been put into a coma. The judge also took into account the witness statements provided by the pediatrician who had treated the boy during the initial blood test, who stated that the barbiturates found in his system could have been anything, such as simple cough syrup. Mary Thompson, the mother, wasn't the only one feeling the fallout from Jimmy's World. Throughout the community, many of those that were plagued by addictions were now fearful of the walls closing in around them. Those that might have been willing to seek help were now worried that Jimmy's story and its aftermath could result in their own children being taken away from them. They were all worried that Mary Thompson was just the first of many, and that the next potential drug abuser with kids would be made an example of. With the story beginning to bear fruit in the real world, some at the Washington Post continued to quietly voice their disbelief in Janet Cooke. Outside of the discrepancies I've already described, such as parts of the story sounding unrealistic or slightly racist, many took issue with the way the story was described by Janet herself. Namely, how she had described her encounters with the family in the article, and how she had originally endeared herself to a group of delinquent drug addicts. Elsa Walsh, Cooke's roommate and another reporter, said about her, quote, "She's the kind of person who has fears for her own safety. My own instincts told me it was wrong. She would have real trouble going into the Jimmy setting. And then, when I tried to put what I know of Janet together with the story itself, they wouldn't fit." Vivian Applin Brownlee, Janet's supervisor at the time for the Weekly, stated, quote, "I had been tough on Janet. She knew it, and I knew it. But when I first read the story, I was astonished. I thought it was going to be about the use of heroin that causes skin ulcers. That's what it started out to be. I never believed it, and I told Milton that. I knew her so well and the depth of her. In her eagerness to make a name, she would write farther than the truth would allow." The Milton that Vivian speaks of is Milton Coleman, an editor for the Washington Post, who had originally dispatched Cooke to write the story about Jimmy instead of the new strand of heroin. He had also expressed his doubts at the validity of the story. However, these doubts did not affect the opinion of assistant managing editor Bob Woodward, the same man who Janet Cooke had once aspired to work alongside. Woodward, believing in the goodwill of his staff and reporters, not only continued to stand behind the story, but also Cooke's reporting. So much so, in fact, that he submitted the story of Jimmy's World for one of the year's Pulitzer Prizes in the first half of 1981. It was submitted in the category of feature writing, which rewards both literary esteem and originality. At the time, Janet Cooke was preparing another feature for release, likely another front-page publication. This one was about a 14-year-old sex worker and her 20-year-old pimp, and seemed poised to make waves in the same way that Jimmy's World had, if not even more so. That story, whether it was valid or fictional, would never get to see release. On April 3rd, 1981, the decisions for the Pulitzer Prizes were made. 2 members of the Pulitzer Advisory Board, esteemed professors and journalists from around the nation, contacted Ben Bradlee. Bradlee, the executive editor in charge of the Washington Post, then called his fellow editors. Together, they all called Janet Cooke, who was in New Haven, Connecticut, following the Ronald Reagan assassination attempt for the Washington Post. While the editors of the Post were elated to share the news, Cooke was shocked to learn that she had actually won the award. She would later state that she had never wanted it, despite the Pulitzer being one of her many career goals. That evening, she bought herself a bottle of champagne and shut herself in her motel room, watching the TV show Dallas. At the time, it was described as a humble means of celebration, but I think we could all see it for what it is now, a means of coping with the walls that were beginning to close in around Janet Cooke. You see, the Pulitzer Prize is one of the most prestigious awards a writer can obtain. However, as Cooke would later describe, the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing put a figurative target on her back. Other great writers were deprived of the award because of her, and they were some of the most diligent journalists and researchers in America. Funnily enough, though, it wasn't one of those writers that ultimately led to Janet Cooke's downfall. It was a specter of the past that she had left behind, a friendly face that was actually proud of her accomplishments. Before working for the Washington Post, Janet Cooke had worked for The Blade, a paper from her hometown of Toledo, Ohio. After finding out that one of their own had been awarded the prestigious Pulitzer Prize for feature writing, they wanted to run a short little bio piece. However, after looking through the accolades being presented by the Associated Press, the reporters for the Toledo Blade began to express some disbelief. They contacted the AP and informed them that their version of Janet Cooke differed in some pretty significant ways. The biographical version of Janet Cooke being published on the Associated Press had been written by Cooke herself, and it had some pretty serious fabrications. In addition to some various falsehoods, such as lying about how many languages she was fluent in, she had made some pretty serious leaps in her academic achievements. She had lied about graduating magna cum laude from Vassar College. In reality, she had only attended Vassar for her freshman year. She claimed to have a master's degree from Toledo University. In reality, she only had a bachelor's. Also, she had never attended the Sorbonne, a prestigious French school in Paris. The Associated Press reached out to the Washington Post, asking for the editors in charge of that paper to get to the bottom of the issue. Was Janet Cooke actually lying, or had there been some serious miscommunications about her achievements? On April 14th, 1981, the editors of the Washington Post called Janet Cooke into the office and began questioning her over her credentials. Executive editor Ben Bradlee would later describe this as one of the most unpleasant conversations he had ever had. Ms. Cooke confessed that she had lied about many of her academic and professional achievements, but that it did not change any of the hard work she had done for the paper. Janet Cooke had claimed to speak 4 languages in her AP bio: French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. The editors asked her to say something, anything, in those 4 languages. She seemed to have a very rudimentary understanding of French, and she knew close to nothing of both Portuguese or Italian. During this initial course of questioning, Janet began to cry, and as the tears began to fall, so did her facade. Quote, "You get caught at the stupidest things." Naturally, the next course of action for the editors of the Post was to question Cooke about the stories she had written, namely Jimmy's World, which was at the forefront of this interrogation. They began asking about the people at the heart of the article, such as the identities of Jimmy, Ron, and Andrea. If they could validate their identities, even anonymously, they could begin to build against any possibilities of a lawsuit. Janet told the editors that Jimmy's real name had been Tyrone Davis. In addition, his mother was named Candy Davis, and her boyfriend, Ron, was really named Robert Jackson. She also gave a location for the story, the home in which she had interviewed the three, and allegedly witnessed the 8-year-old boy being injected with heroin. The editors of the Post decided to take her notes and began pouring through them, while Cooke and a couple of editors and supervisors were dispatched to locate the house and try to make contact with the family at the heart of the story. Hours later, they returned, after Janet had failed to point out the house in question. In fact, she seemed to not be familiar with the neighborhood itself. While they had been gone, the editors had been going through Janet's 100+ pages of notes, and they had been listening to her nearly 2 hours of recorded interviews. There were rumors of a child being injected with drugs, but they were allegations by a social worker here and there. There was nothing definitive, nothing truthful. Janet Cooke pitifully asked Post editor Bob Woodward if he believed in the validity of the story. His response? Quote, "No, I don't, and I'm going to prove it if it's the last thing I do." Over the rest of the evening, and into the early morning hours, Janet Cooke was taken to task by the editors and executives of the Washington Post. They had placed their faith in her and the validity of her reporting, and were now beginning to find out how little both of them were worth. In between bouts of defending her skills as a reporter and breaking down crying, Cooke told another reporter, quote, "I have to believe the story." She had placed her entire career on the line for this story, and she was now insistent that she continued defending it. It wasn't until 1:45 a.m. on the morning of April 15th that the editors left Janet alone with a friendly face, another reporter that had become a trusted co-worker for Janet. Here is Ben Bradlee describing how it all unfolded.
In the middle of your book, you tell a story about how David Marinus played a role in the Janet Cooke story.
Well, he was, I think his title was Deputy Metro Editor. He was Bob Woodward's deputy when Woodward was Metro Editor, and we had learned that Janet Cooke had probably fabricated this entire story about an 8-year-old heroin addict, but she hadn't admitted it yet. And we had sort of been trying to get her to admit that.
How old was she?
Her late 20s.
What year was this?
1981.
She was a black woman.
Black woman. Beautiful black woman. And a terrific reporter. Great writer.
Vassar graduate.
She wasn't a Vassar graduate. That was the problem. She'd attended Vassar for 1 year, and that's how we were tipped off that when she, you know, the worst possible thing that could happen to her happened. She won the Pulitzer Prize for this story. And the Pulitzer Committee put out her biography, and in the biography, which was written from information she had supplied, it said that she was a Vassar honors graduate. And I got this call some days later saying, from somebody in the dean's office at Vassar saying, "I think we got a little problem." And we sure did. But anyway, Marinus, some editors said, you know, take us to the house of this little kid. And she couldn't do it. And we had people speak foreign languages to her and that she couldn't speak, although she said she could. And then finally, we left her alone with Marinus. And it was then that she had said, I was scared they'd leave me alone with you because I can handle the other guys, but I can't handle you. And she confessed that she'd made it all up.
After 11 hours of intense grilling, when she had to withstand the scrutiny of some of the nation's most esteemed journalists and reporters, Janet Cooke finally confessed to the hoax. Quote, "There is no Jimmy and no family. It was a fabrication. I did so much work on it, but it's a composite. I want to give the prize back." She was, of course, talking about the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing, which had been awarded to her a little over a day beforehand. Within that day, she had gone from the highest peak of the journalism world to the deepest, darkest trench. On April 15, 1981, Janet Cooke officially tendered her resignation from the Washington Post. Her letter of resignation read, quote, "Jimmy's World was in essence a fabrication. I never encountered or interviewed an 8-year-old heroin addict. The September 28, 1980 article in the Washington Post was a serious misrepresentation which I deeply regret. I apologize to my newspaper, my profession, the Pulitzer Board, and all seekers of the truth. Today, in facing up to the truth, I have submitted my resignation. Janet Cooke." That letter was published in the day's version of the Washington Post, just a little over 6 months after the original publication of Jimmy's World. The Pulitzer Prize for feature writing was revoked from Janet Cooke and instead given to columnist Teresa Carpenter of The Village Voice. Her story, which was regarding the death of model Dorothy Stratton, was very well deserving of the award. Later that day, on the 15th of April, Donald E. Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, held a press conference in which he admitted the story was fraudulent. This was followed up by another article in the following day's paper, April 16th, 1981, in which the editors of the Post apologized for the misleading article. Quote, "Cooke now acknowledges that she never met or interviewed any of those people, and that she made up the story of Jimmy based on a composite of information about heroin addiction in Washington gleaned from various social workers and other sources." Within days, an impromptu staff meeting was called at the home of editor Bob Woodward. This meeting, which contained many of the Post editors and reporters, tried to address the issues which had led to this scandal happening. It tried to address behind-the-scenes issues, such as insufficient guidance and discomfort for new reporters, as well as the system which pit reporters against one another. After all, each reporter was gunning for what the editors, including Ben Bradlee and Bob Woodward, referred to as a, quote, "holy shit story," something reminiscent of their work on the Watergate scandal a decade beforehand. Each reporter was trying to hit a home run on each piece, and this had created an environment where someone like Janet Cooke was inspired to fabricate an entire story just to get a leg up on her colleagues. Ben Bradlee released a quote during this time period, in which he addressed how the Post needed to work on rebuilding its credibility. Quote, "It is a tragedy that someone as talented and promising as Janet Cooke, with everything going for her, felt that she had to falsify the facts. The credibility of a newspaper is its most precious asset, and it depends almost entirely on this integrity of its reporters. When that integrity is questioned and found wanting, the wounds are grievous, and there is nothing to do but come clean with our readers, apologize to the advisory board of the Pulitzer Prizes, and begin immediately on the uphill task of regaining our credibility. This is what we are doing." This was just the beginning of a long period in which the Washington Post would try and heal the wounds perpetrated by a hoax of this seriousness. On April 19th, 1981, the Washington Post issued an 18,000-word article detailing how an article like Jimmy's World had come to pass. It traced the origins of the article all the way back to Janet Cooke's hiring in January of 1980, all the way into the detailed failures of the editing staff and upper management, who shared a bit of the blame. It also went into painstaking detail the conversations Cooke had had with the editors of the Post, and worked its way through every lie she had ever told, in a fashion that some would consider humiliating. Richard Cohen, who had originally penned a heartfelt op-ed about Jimmy's World, weighed in once again. Quote, "It was such a good story, the editors wanted to get it into the paper. They wanted this so badly, they waived the rules about names and places, overlooked the warning signs, and the story went into the paper. And when it was printed, it created such a fuss that a columnist like myself, wondering why a pusher would talk to a reporter, and wondering even more why he would shoot up some kid for free, wrote about it anyway. It was such a good issue, such a wonderful controversy. I, too, wanted to believe." Bob Woodward, who had already become a legendary reporter at this point in 1981, had to weigh in on the scandal in various quotes, which I'll try and lay out here. Quote, "I have used the phrase in for a dime, in for a dollar to describe my overall conclusion about submitting the Cooke story for a Pulitzer or any other prize. I believed it, we believed it. Official questions had been raised, but we stood by the story and her. Internal questions had been raised, but none about her other work. The reports were about the story not sounding right, being based on anonymous sources, and primarily about purported lies about her personally. 2 reporters she had dated, and 1 who felt in close competition with her. I think the decision to nominate the story for a Pulitzer is of minimal consequence. I also think that it won is of little consequence. It is a brilliant story, fake and fraud that it is. Bob Woodward, who has since gone on to become an even further legend in the world of journalism and has published a dozen best-selling books, was possibly hurt by the publication of Jimmy's World. When Ben Bradlee retired as the executive editor of the Post in 1991, many had pegged Woodward to be his replacement, but the cloud of Jimmy's World continued to hang over him, and it's widely believed that this piece resulted in Woodward never getting that position at the paper.
You were an editor at the Washington Post during probably the biggest embarrassment of Bradlee's career, the Janet Cooke fiasco, the fabricated tale of an 8-year-old heroin addict post having to get back to Pulitzer. How did Ben deal with that?
I wasn't just there. I was the supervising editor of Janet Cooke. Let's put the blame where it belongs, on me. And I wasn't skeptical enough. And when it turned out that it was a fraud, and she won the Pulitzer Prize, and we gave the Pulitzer Prize back, Ben's solution was a typical Bradlee solution. Said, we've got an ombudsman, called him in, Bill Green, and said, you are going to investigate this, you're going to talk to everyone, you are going to go as deep as you can. And he published this voluminous article in the Post. I mean, it went on page after page, and it was tough on Bradlee, tough on me, tough on the culture of the Post. And what Ben said afterwards, there's nothing about that Janet Cooke affair that wasn't in that article. No one found out anything more about it because he turned the ombudsman loose, like he turned his reporters loose, and he had to take the punishment. I remember the New Republic wrote a very mean article about Ben and the Post and the whole culture and so forth, and Ben ran into the editor of the New Republic, and this is the Bradlee we knew. He looked at him and he covered his privates and smiled.
Speaking of Ben Bradlee.
When Ben retired, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan put the admiration of many into a poem. O rare Ben Bradlee, his reign has ceased, but his nation stands, its strength increased.
Many consider this scandal to be the dark mark on his own career. Despite going on to obtain a sterling reputation, even being awarded the highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, by Barack Obama in 2013, this was the scandal that lingered at the bottom of Bradlee's resume. Jeff Himmelman, who wrote a biography about Bradlee, described this. Quote, there was some real anguish about it. He felt like he had let the Grahams down, who had shown so much faith in him through Watergate. It was their paper, and he did not catch this. And he knew he didn't catch it. And there were a lot of other people who should have caught it too, but it was his name at the top. By far, this was the biggest black eye of his career. The Janet Cooke scandal would continue to linger over the Washington Post for years afterward. Every time a story from the paper would be nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, no matter how valid or truthful, that strange feeling would tickle at the back of the advisory board's neck. And, other than awards, the people's faith in their news media had been permanently damaged, planting seeds of doubt that we are continuing to see blossom today.
The only saving grace in the Janet Cooke scandal is that the world doesn't know anything about the Janet Cooke case that the Washington Post didn't tell them. We decided immediately, I mean at 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke Joe Pulitzer up and said, there's a disaster and we're sending you back your prize. And Joe couldn't believe it. I mean, he said, well, it'll pass over or something. And I said, no, it won't pass over. And it's gone out, Federal Express, that night. We immediately assigned our ombudsman and said, you have total access to everybody, and you will not be censored. And you write it as, just explain it, explain everything. And it was written, and there's never, I mean, that was the definitive word. There's no other word. If editors think that they can avoid that, I take my hat off to them. There's absolutely no way you can avoid disaster if somebody wants to lie to you. There's no foolproof system. You can catch them in most of the lies, but that was such a lie that nobody could conceive of it. Also, there were some interesting things about that. There was an artist's drawing. You know, the story was about an 8-year-old heroin addict. There was an artist's drawing of that kid, and it was one of those extremely vivid pictures, and it ran on the front page of the paper. And I think it made us all feel that we knew this kid, Jimmy, a given name. Also, the mayor on the following day said he knew who Jimmy was. And any guard that we might have had went totally down when the mayor of your city says he knew it was. And there was a psychiatrist, I think, or a drug counselor at Howard University who said 2 days later that she was treating the family. I mean, it didn't occur to us that it didn't exist. I mean, in light of those evidences.
Other than the Washington Post, there was an entire demographic of reporters hit hard by the Janet Cooke scandal. Juliana Malveaux, an award-winning author and commentator, put it best. Quote, "What happened with Cooke was a disappointment to African-American journalists. It was a hit. We all took it on the chin. People were excited when she got a Pulitzer, and then when it was returned, people were like, someone had pulled a rug out from under you. It basically eroded the integrity of a cadre of African-American journalists who do street reporting. It made people look at people of color, and African-Americans in particular, with more scrutiny. Janet Cooke gave white folks permission to be skeptical about black people in the newsroom. In the end, I'm still concerned for Cooke. She made a major journalistic mistake, but she's a human being and deserves to be seen through that prism. She had great writing chops, but she used them the wrong way." These quotes do a really great job of describing an issue that plagued black reporters for a period of time after the Jimmy's World scandal. However, I think they also cut at the heart of the issue, which is summed up by one of Janet Cooke's co-workers, another African-American reporter named Cortland Malloy. Quote, "For all the glamour and prestige that Janet supposedly brought with her to the Post, they put her straight into the ghetto. With all her credentials, Janet still went to the Weekly. That was just very telling to me." It's a very valid point. Janet was just one of a number of minority reporters hired in the early 1980s, and despite being relative newcomers to the international stage of the Washington Post, they were all given assignments that seemed to fit their skin color, as opposed to their writing style or their prior history. In the aftermath of the Janet Cooke scandal, there were various people hurt and disenfranchised. Reporters, especially minority journalists, were being viewed more skeptically than ever. Drug addicts were afraid to seek help, after the sirens of a pending war on drugs had been raised by Nancy Reagan and others like her. Craig Reinerman and Ceres Duskin, in a 1992 sociological analysis of Jimmy's World and its potential aftereffects, stated, quote, "There is nothing in the scientific literature to suggest that addicts recommend addiction to anyone, much less their own kids. The media apparently knew so little about heroin that they could simply assume it induced depravity and transformed users into the sort of vile subhumans who think nothing of doing such things. Clearly, heroin can be powerfully addicting, but even if it were capable of morally lobotomizing all addicts, why would such addicts give away the very expensive stuff for which they repeatedly lie, cheat, and steal? America's guardians of truth had no touchstone of truth on drug problems apart from their own scare stories. In this, the Washington Post was no worse than most media institutions in the United States. When seen as part of the historical pattern of news coverage of drug issues, the Pulitzer Prize-winning fraud was less a lapse than part of a long tradition. On almost any other subject, editors' crap detectors would have signaled that something was amiss. One of the people most personally wounded was none other than Janet Cooke's own father, Stratman Cooke. Quote, "What did I do that went wrong? I knew I was away from home a lot, had to travel a lot, but I could not have it both ways. She was extremely ambitious, eager to prove herself. I encouraged that." Many have tried to figure out the root cause of the Jimmy's World hoax. Was it a case of blind ambition, or was it something more than that? Could the behavior of Janet Cooke be traced back to a single problem, or was she a symptom of a much larger issue in the world of journalism? Jonathan Newman, a staff reporter for the Metro section of the Washington Post, weighed in during the Pulitzer Prize revocation. Quote, "It was not pressure that did Janet in. No pressure can do that. That had to come from within her. She wanted page one." However, one of Newman's own colleagues at the Metro desk had an opposite reaction. Quote, "Pressures are so great to produce, to go beyond excellence to the holy shit story. Everyone knows that's what the editors want. The pressure is to get the incredible story, the extraordinary story. When you put that up against a fragile and vulnerable personality like Janet's, you produce the worst case." A little under a year after her resignation from the Washington Post, Janet Cooke resurfaced for the first time. In the interim year, she had married an attorney and moved to Maryland. She had tried writing for both Cosmopolitan magazine and the Washingtonian, but neither had worked out. After those writing gigs failed to result in anything being published, she had begun working at a local Bloomingdale's. At least until the cameras showed up to document her fall from grace. She quit that very day and never showed up for another day of work. On January 29th, 1982, Janet Cooke appeared on The Phil Donahue Show, speaking with its host and namesake. She tried to explain herself a little, and hopefully help build a bridge that could get her back into the world of writing. Quote, "I simply wanted to write a story I had been working on so that I would not have to go back and say I cannot do it. I did not want to fail." At the time that Jimmy's World began to materialize, she had already been working on the heroin story for over 2 months. Quote, "If I did not produce a story, then how was I to justify my time?" Throughout the interview, she expressed humility and embarrassment at the whole fiasco. After all, she had been a 26-year-old young woman that only wanted to write, and claimed to have lost herself in a world of blind ambition. Quote, "I'm not a little witch, and I would like to be left in peace now." Janet Cooke stayed out of the public eye for the next few years, during which time her name became synonymous with hoaxes and falsehoods. She eventually moved to France in 1985, deciding that leaving the country would be better than to be maligned for all of journalism's ills. Janet Cooke remained an enigma, staying out of popular culture for over a decade. It was not until 1996 that she surfaced once again in an article published by GQ. The piece was written by Mike Sager, her former colleague at the Washington Post and ex-boyfriend. To date, it remains one of the very few interviews Cooke has conducted with anyone. Janet's World, as it was called, paints a very convincing portrait of Janet's mindset at the time. She had been raised in a family where expectations were very high, and after being immersed in the deep end of the glamorous Washington Post, she began to lose herself. Quote, "I regret that I did it. I was guilty, I did it, and I'm sorry that I did. I am ashamed that I did it." The 1996 article details how Janet's life had fallen into complete disarray in the years since Jimmy's World was published. She had once been a promising young journalist who got a job at the Washington Post at the age of 26, and who seemed poised to win many awards over a long and illustrious writing career. At this point, she was 41 years old, freshly divorced, and she had been working at a Kalamazoo, Michigan department store. There, she was earning a tad over $6 an hour, and she was struggling to pay for her asthma medication, seeing how she could not even afford health insurance. Quote, "I don't think that in this particular case the punishment has fit the crime. I've lost my voice. I've lost half of my life. I'm in a situation where cereal has become a viable dinner choice. If it had not been for my mother, I might have been homeless." At the end of the article, Janet begins to lament over a youth lost, all because of a simple lie that quickly grew out of proportion. Quote, "It is my fault that I've never spoken up, but I'm a 41-year-old woman now. If only people understood why this really happened. Maybe they'd have a different take on things. Maybe they'd think I wasn't so evil." Janet Cooke has continued to live as an outcast. She has stayed in occasional touch with Mike Sager, her ex-boyfriend, who has gone on to have a long and prosperous career in writing and journalism. However, very little is known about Cooke or her life. Sager, respecting Janet's wishes, has not talked much about her. All he has said about Janet Cooke is that she is currently living in the United States, she has a family, and is now firmly rooted in a career that does not involve writing. He has released a line that Janet wrote in one of their emails from recent years. Quote, "What more is there for anyone to write? Essentially, I've spent the last 30 years waiting to die." Mike Sager describes that line as carrying a bit of Janet Cooke's sardonic charm, but perhaps containing an unhealthy dose of truth. However, over the last 30 years, it has not been all bad for Janet Cooke. After the 1996 publication of Janet's World, Mike Sager's exclusive GQ article, the story was then shopped to various film studios. The rights to the story were sold to TriStar Pictures later that year for a total of $1.6 million, over half of which was payable upon the start of principal photography. Over the years, that movie has not come to realization. Filming never started, which meant that not only would most of the money be unattainable by Janet Cooke and Mike Sager, who did retain 45% of the sale for himself, but that TriStar Pictures basically paid $750,000 for the basic idea of Janet's story. It was a tragic fall from grace, detailing the beginning of America's lost faith in the media, which appealed itself to Stacy Snyder, then the production chief of TriStar Pictures. Quote, "I was fascinated by the relationship between a young editorial puppy and a temptress finding her way in a really sexy world. Cooke's character is fascinating, charming, tragic, all that good stuff. All that good stuff." Journalism has become forever changed because of the Jimmy's World hoax. Many credit the Janet Cooke fall from grace as a major impetus for investigative reform. Editors began to more stringently authenticate stories, no longer allowing reporters to have free rein. Now, anonymous sources are shared with editors to make sure that outliers like this no longer exist. According to Donald Graham, the then publisher of the Washington Post, and whose family would continue to play a prominent role at the paper for the next 3 decades. Quote, "The paper absolutely changed that moment." Howard Kurtz, a noted journalist who has worked with various publications and news channels, stated about the whole ordeal. Quote, "The Janet Cooke fabrication was shocking because it came at a time when most people respected newspapers and respected what we now call the media. Cooke was a warning shot. It was a harbinger of all kinds of journalistic scandals to come. One reason we're even still talking about what happened in 1981 is because Janet Cooke was to the news media what Vietnam and Watergate were to political establishments." Journalist Richard Prince has shared a similar thought about Janet Cooke. Quote, 30 years later, Cooke's name is synonymous with the hoax she created. Her story is taught in journalism schools, and some say a portion of the damage she wreaked on the credibility of the news media remains.